We are live. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, Roni. Thank you for hosting the session today. So we'll take the usual couple of minutes to welcome everybody and wait that everybody rolls in before Roni gets started. So feel free to say hi in the chat as usual. Tell us where you're joining from. I'm in France today. It's super hot and sunny. And Roni, you are in the Bay Area, right?
Yeah, I'm in Sunnyvale, which, true to its name, is kind of sunny most of the time, but weather is great today, at least.
Nice. All right, cool. And we're also live on the YouTube channel. So Ardit from Amsterdam. Like Joe the Sentinel. Nice, yeah. Yeah, I'm also in the northern part of France, which is usually always super rainy, but today's a good day. Yeah, so as usual, feel free to drop your questions. So we'll have about a 25-30 minute session with Roni, and then we'll open up the Q&A. But if you have any questions, throughout the talk, feel free to drop them in the chat, or even better, use the Q&A feature, because then we can order them and make sure that we go through everything and nobody gets lost. Yeah, the session is being recorded, so we'll ship the recording to you tomorrow, so no need to take notes or anything, don't worry. And yeah, people will keep joining, but I think we can already get started, Roni. So we'll cover, Roni will cover how to best use OpenTelemetry with a bunch of other tools like Jaeger and Prometheus. Quite interesting. We actually had the founder of OpenTelemetry on, I think, a few months ago, and that session I remember had a ton of questions and really good ones as well. So over to you, Roni, and yeah, the stage is yours, and I'll shut up and disappear for a while.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Hopefully be able to see it. Yep, and hopefully you can see my slides now.
Yep.
Great. So thanks for having me. And today I'm here to talk about kind of one of my favorite topics, which is continuous feedback and how to leverage OpenTelemetry for that. But before I begin, maybe I'll give just a few small things that relate to this, that also relate to my personal kind of journey. So just about me, I'm kind of a board game geek. It's one of my favorite pastimes, especially the more finicky and complex and weird the game, the more I like it. But career-wise, I think one of the things that really always kind of tormented me was that I was always torn between two worlds. One is engineering and the other is product management. And I don't know, maybe some of you can sympathize, but whenever I was doing a very engineering job, or kind of doing development in the trenches, I always wanted to know more about the use cases and kind of have a say and think about how do we actually make this better in terms of what this feature accomplishes. And as an engineer, this always kind of bugged me. So I went and became a product manager. But then, of course, as a product manager, I was missing kind of the hands-on and coding. So the tragedy of kind of my evolution as a developer was that I was always kind of torn between these two worlds. And as a result, I made up a lot of weird positions that allowed me to balance them in one way or the other. The last thing is that I am very much enthusiastic and really interested in how to make DevOps processes better and development processes in general. So I've been working with large teams, with small teams, and one of the things that always concerned me is how can we actually optimize and make this better at scale? And this fascination of mine has lately led me to found Digma, which is an open source platform that deals with just these topics. So I'm mentioning this not only because it's kind of a trivia fact about me, but also because it kind of directly relates to the topic at hand, which is continuous feedback. And to understand why, I want to talk about kind of where I spent most of my time when I mentioned that I've been kind of optimizing development processes and trying to make kind of the release loop, the DevOps loop, kind of as optimized as possible. And the truth is that I've concentrated most of my time on this motion from left to right. So how do we make code ship faster? How do we make the release process more efficient? The velocity or cadence of the releases is something I really excelled at accelerating and making much more efficient, improving automated tests, creating CI/CD pipelines. And this was, I think, mainly my focus as of a few years back. Now, a CI/CD pipeline, as you know, looks something like this. It's exactly what I was just discussing. You start, developer writes some code in the IDE, makes changes to the source control, all sorts of triggers start happening, unit tests run, then different stages of the CI/CD pipeline, start testing your code, you deploy it to production, and you're done, supposedly. But when I was looking at this kind of DevOps loop, I also noticed, and I kind of looked at different diagrams, different variations of this, and I like this one because it has a lot of tools that supposedly kind of associate with each stage. Something here seemed to be missing. And you can take a second to kind of look at this diagram and think for yourself, what do you think is missing here or maybe misrepresented? And when I saw this diagram for the first time, it completely jumped out to me because there seems to be so many tools associated with each stage of the DevOps pipeline, except for continuous feedback. If we look at the continuous feedback section here, we can see Salesforce is here for some reason. I still haven't quite figured out why that was put there. But it made me think about the fact that I could be wrong in optimizing just for speed and cadence. So continuous feedback means that there is some sort of information flowing back from production so that you can improve your code and kind of continually improve the product. And if you just concentrate on speed, you may end up with results that are subpar. From a product level, I knew that because I was a product manager for many years and I knew how to use the tools of the trade to get feedback on that, Google Analytics or many of the commercial tools that are available today that let you know how the features you roll out fare in the real world, how users are adopting them, what works, what doesn't. But if all we concentrate on from an engineering perspective is speed, what we're actually doing is kind of throwing code over the fence at a higher velocity or in shorter intervals, which kind of defeats the purpose of what we were trying to accomplish with kind of creating this incremental process, short releases, accelerating them. All of that makes sense only if it is tied with some kind of feedback that you receive back in order to know whether you did the right thing or not. So I'll give a concrete example of what I mean. So let's take an average developer. This could have been any developer in my team. And there is a Kanban board or a Scrum board or whatever it is that they're using, and they want to develop features. So they develop the feature, they make the code changes, and then they test it. They run their automated test. The CI works perfectly. They release it. And what is the next thing that they would do? The answer is usually they would move on to the next feature, right? But if you notice, there is only arrows leading in one direction here. So I rolled out a feature, I merged it, it's in production, but I did not check on it. My ownership of the feature ends at this cliff where I push this feature over, and now it's kind of there to fend for itself. This has to do maybe with the definition of done. So when we look at what we consider done, and there is done and there is done, and I've seen organizations talk about done, but each of these done phases, it seems that we're kind of pushing the limits and moving it more and more to the right. So once being done meant I finished coding, I'm going to give this code to QA, let them deal with the issues there. Then done became I'm done with this code, but I've also added some tests and I've added a way to deploy it, and now it's ready. But still, it needs to mean also the fact that I'm done when I've rolled this feature and I know that I'm really done with it because it's field tested, because it actually works, because the fix that I rolled in, or the change that I made in the query, not only works on test data, but it works on the real life, because I know that I'm not accumulating technical debt. And this lack of feedback has other consequences as well. So, when I push a change to prod, this is how I really want to feel, right? Developers usually kind of get to be the superheroes. Very optimistic. There's been a ton of studies about how developers are really optimistic about their estimations, about code, about everything. My tests are green, so I get this sense of confidence. And yet, because the definition of done is as it is, because I'm still pushing code over a cliff, and somebody would call me maybe later at night if there was an issue with code that I pushed that caused issues or misery to end users, often this is how I feel. Because I know that once the code left kind of my field of view, I have no more visibility about how it's doing, except when it's already too late. And what I did notice is that kind of 99% of the time when observability is used, or monitoring, or APMs, or whatever you want to call these tools, it is already when there is a critical problem, and now we're in troubleshooting mode, or fire brigade mode, or really need to be those superheroes because we need to save the day because something is wrong. And that is something that I feel could be prevented. So continuous feedback deals with the fact that when we develop our code, usually we have a gap in the type of information we get back. So my local runtime, when I'm working locally in my dev machine, I have a lot of feedback. I can debug, I can troubleshoot, I can see a lot of information there. My test runtime gives me some feedback. There are issues with that as well, because tests are very prone to biases. There's been a lot of kind of people who are really smart wrote about confirmation bias and other issues with tests where I'm writing my assumptions down rather than testing them. But still, they do offer some feedback, be it limited. But when we talk about production, we don't usually get a lot of feedback, again, except when things are already wrong. And we don't usually consult that feedback unless things are already wrong. So what does continuous feedback mean? So if a normal CI/CD pipeline, as we discussed, kind of looks like this, this left to right motion from IDE to production with different stages along the way. And a continuous feedback pipeline is kind of the opposite. It starts with production from the right. It then goes through different stages that analyze the observability data that is coming from production. And then the output of continuous feedback is back in the source control and back in the IDE where I'm working to kind of complete the loop. So I hope that as a concept kind of makes sense. We'll take a look at a more detailed example in a second. But before I do, I want to kind of take an aside for a second and discuss something that is very tangent to this topic, which is OpenTelemetry. So OpenTelemetry has been introduced not that long ago. I think less than a year ago, it hit 1.0 at the KubeCon. And I feel it is one of the most important technologies that relate to using observability in dev and specifically also continuous feedback. And there are several reasons for that. And these reasons, I feel, should kind of make each and every developer start looking at OpenTelemetry and how they can leverage it. The first reason OpenTelemetry is really, really important is because it created kind of a consensus. So there were a lot of proprietary protocols, specs, agents, all sorts of different, like each commercial product was conceiving their own better than others, supposedly, approach to how to solve observability. And what this kind of created was a big split in the ecosystem. It was very hard to create tools that support all of these different specs and products. So no matter which kind of commercial APM you were using, if I wanted to create an open source tool, or if we wanted to see more ecosystem tools that provide extra value on top of that, it would have been very difficult because we'd need to support so many different specs and formats. So I really hate this word because it's been really used in very markety terms lately, but it's really been a democratization of the observability information, because suddenly you see information that's very structured in similar ways, for example, tracing information. Everybody agrees on how to structure it, and you can start seeing tools appear in the ecosystem that start bringing more value and making it more relevant and more effective when you want to use these tools beyond just the big commercial products. The other aspect is that, yeah, go ahead.
We just have a couple questions in the chat, maybe that we can get to real quick while you go through, if that's cool, or do you want to wait?
No, that is very cool.
Okay, so Angel, I think, was asking, do you mean reverse engineer what actions need to be taken, focusing on the business operational outcomes rather than the data input and resources?
So I'm not sure kind of what is meant by reverse engineering, but my intention is a bit different. What I mean is that usually, let's say I want to roll out a piece of code, and usually when I do that, I'm kind of operating within this bubble. And this bubble is my IDE, where I see the code, and it's completely separate from everything that occurs in production. So, I sometimes look at functions and I kind of think to myself, the stories that these functions could tell us if we only kind of knew how they were actually working, what kind of runtimes error they were actually seeing, how they're performing. Are they okay? Is my code change really the correct one? So it's these kind of changes where I think today we're suddenly at this inflection point around observability, where all of that information is there. There is no longer kind of a lacking of information. We have tons of information, too much maybe. But that information is not being utilized by developers when they're actually doing their development work. It's being utilized after the fact when there is an issue, maybe in completely asynchronous process or other processes inside the organizations that are around monitoring or kind of trying to optimize production, kind of looking at it sideways. But when you look at the core development loop, that information is really missing there. Hope that answers the question.
I think you had a follow-up. Does this require redesign of existing dev and ops roles?
No, it does not. And I'll talk about kind of OTel in a sec and maybe give an example. But one of the really great benefits of OTel, and it's kind of the one that's to the most right on this, or to the right on this slide, is that the batteries are already included, meaning that when OTel kind of reached a consensus, it made it very easy for many operating kind of, for many maintainers and contributors to many platforms and programming languages to actually add support. So some programming languages, .NET is an example, actually included OTel support in the standard library. So much of a consensus it's become. Other tools and platforms just added very easy to use kind of extension points that include OTel. So the experience today, if I want to include OTel in my project, is really, it kind of feels like turning the lights on. It doesn't require any big changes except kind of sometimes importing a package and saying, okay, this is where I want to send the information. And as we'll see in a sec, most of the information already exists. I think the bigger change is more towards the culture. So we need to teach the developers to look beyond just their deployment and be curious and kind of evidence-based in how they look at their features and in what kind of they seek in terms of affirmation that the feature is working. And there are a lot of ways to do that in the process. For example, just like we include meetings where we discuss the planning and backlog grooming, we also need to kind of set aside time to look for feedback and see whether last week's features are really what we need them to be.
Nice. We have a few more, but I think let's keep going for now, and then we can get to this later.
Perfect. So I do have some sample code that I created. Let's see if we'll have time to dive in a little deeper into it. But I will give the link to that application. And what I try to do with this sample code that uses OpenTelemetry and Prometheus and Jaeger and all of these different frameworks was I tried to create something that's less of a very thin CRUD app, as you'll see most examples are, meaning there is not a lot of business logic and it's not a very real life scenario, and try to make something that has some more depth to it. So just trying to find any interesting topic. I decided I was just watching with my kids. I was just watching Harry Potter with my kids lately. So I said, okay, let's maybe create an API for the Gringotts Vault, because why not, right? So in order to do that, I created an application. In this case, I was using Python Fast API, but it's very easy to make different types of, or use different types of technologies to make this same kind of workflow. And I was using RabbitMQ as a queuing layer. I had another worker service, Postgres, and an external API I was using to kind of do some of the money conversions and currency kind of rates between wizarding world's currency and the real world currency, just to create a scenario that has multiple stages to it, and that actually includes business or domain logic that we can then kind of start seeing the complexity that developers deal with every day, kind of trying to understand how this works. And the first thing that happened when I was looking at this example was that I noticed just how much support there is already. And in this case, I was using Python, so this isn't PyP, but there are an equivalent amount of packages for Node, for .NET, for Golang, for any of these languages, where there is so much support because OpenTelemetry has become a consensus or something that we can start kind of counting on as de facto standard, that just by enabling all of these switches, kind of adding a package saying, okay, turn on, and then kind of following those steps, and without changing my code at all, so without adding any custom instrumentation or in tracing, you would kind of create a span construct, which is kind of like a log, but it encapsulates an operation that contains multiple steps and allows you to follow who's calling it and how it performs and other aspects. And we'll look at that in a sec. So that when I looked at the architecture, this is what it looked like. So all of these purple diamond-shaped markers are actually free. They're automatic instrumentation that I received just by activating specific packages. So even without adding additional logic to in a more fine-tuned kind of granular way, look at different processes within my application, just by turning on these knobs, I already received a lot of information. And this is what I meant before when I said that today we're not dealing with kind of a problem where there isn't enough information, there is an abundance of information, that it instantly became very relevant. And I was able to kind of look at that and see, what can I find out from here that is interesting? So let's talk about that for a second, because I took this aside to mention that OpenTelemetry has evolved, has a lot of support, and provides a lot of data. But going back to continuous feedback and development processes, what do we want to do with that feedback, with that information? So let's go back to the story of our developer. I randomly named Bill. And the first stage where they want to see and kind of use feedback from production is actually even before even releasing any code. It's as left as you can imagine when I'm actually still writing the code. And these questions that I could think to myself, and there could be many others, kind of originate from this gap that exists between my dev environment and my prod environment. And looking at them, they just seem trivial, but somehow we don't really have a good answer for them. So, as simple as you can think, when looking at code in the IDE, who is using this code? Is it even used? Am I looking at dead code? Is this code that maybe my tests are using, but hasn't been reached in production for the last 3 years? Or is it something that is very heavily used, and who will I be affecting if I change it in terms of other microservices in their organization? And the more complex and evolved the architectures of modern applications became, the more it is hard to estimate what is the blast radius of my changes and who should I actually include in my testing when I roll out the feature. The other aspect has to do with the fact that while I'm describing everything here as a pipeline, in fact, usually it's kind of an illusion because things happen all at once. So to give an example, usually when I develop code, it's true that I'm developing a specific feature, but it's a very associative thing. I'm working on one thing, then I notice I need to fix another thing. Then I want to do a refactoring. Then I want to include several more components. And I, of course, kind of separate these changes and do it incrementally and follow all of the refactoring best practices. But the truth is that software systems continually evolve, and looking just at the more simplified kind of features going down the pipeline view can be very simplistic and often misleading, because you're often kind of changing a lot of things at once. So looking at this code, it would be great to see, well, I'm changing this function. Is there any other thing I should know about? Or is there any issue here? What is the current way the runtime errors are being handled? Do I have timeouts here? Okay, that might be fine, but are these timeouts escalating? Is this something that might worry me sometimes down the line? Is this really optimized for the kind of usage that it's seeing? So all of these questions are really important for any developer to be able to answer in order to introduce the right changes to the code. And this is something that for me was kind of a revelation, because I was always kind of thinking down the line, okay, so I push my code, I need the information back. I was thinking very linearly. But in fact, it's true all the time, because the information is there, it's continually flowing. And just like when you look at this DevOps loop, it is a loop. So the information is already there and should be the basis of my next change. And this relates to the other question that is listed here, which is, what should I optimize for? And this is a really funny question because the person who asked me that question indirectly was someone I talked to who actually works in an observability company. So it was kind of funny to me that he asked that question, and maybe kind of an affirmation that, if they're worried about it, then it's definitely kind of a missing piece. And what he was telling me is, look, I have many developers in my team. And what I see is that sometimes many of them work for long hours trying to optimize this one piece of this code on the kind of micro optimization level, trying to scrape off a millisecond here, a millisecond there. But when I look at the observability, I can see that this is used maybe once a day and has minimal effect and is completely not slowing down any other aspect of the system. On the other hand, being completely oblivious of another piece of code they change, they don't see that it's actually a major bottleneck. It's that code that parses the JSON, or that encrypts the password, or does something that everything kind of almost every flow in the system uses. And making an optimization there would be really great, but also slowing it down would have a horizontal kind of impact across my entire systems. Why am I not aware of that? So all of these different questions are really key questions to ask. And yet the tools that we have to answer them are very meager. So the information is there, the questions are important, but it's very difficult to ask them, or at least to get the right answers. And if we continue, after I checked in or my changes and they go through kind of the GitOps process towards release, somebody then needs to go and maybe code review these changes, right? And he finds himself kind of asking the same questions. So wait, this is a code. What did I miss? And people really hate doing code reviews because it's very difficult to kind of answer these questions without digging a lot deeper into the code. And who has time, right? Code reviews are not well liked sometimes because they push us away from other work that we're doing, because they're a context switch. And as a result, what would happen is either we won't be able to answer these questions, and then we might do, a subpar job reviewing, or we'll need to invest just ridiculous amounts of time trying to do a good code review. And one of the symptoms of that is that we often see history repeating. So, I kind of see it as ghosts in the machine, where there are some areas of the code where the same kind of issues keep reappearing because everybody has a short-term memory. The information is not there, kind of visible, glaring. This is a hotspot. This is a problem area. Please watch out. So we're repeating it because there's only so much you can do looking at somebody else's code and trying to understand what I should be looking for. So I'm going to pause for a second. Are there any other questions in the chat? I'd be happy to kind of do a quick pause before we move on to the next segment.
Yes, we definitely have some. So Gabi was asking, wasn't open tracing there first? Jaeger, Zipkin, not to mention Prometheus. Mm-hmm. I think that might be answered in the next section as well.
Mm-hmm. So OpenTelemetry is kind of the merging of two previously kind of competing standards, which were OpenCensus and OpenTrace. And this is what I meant when I said it was so significant that suddenly we don't have this schism in the ecosystem that we can say, okay, well, it's OpenTelemetry, that's the way to go. And all of the different tools and APMs and platform tools for observability are slowly aligning around OpenTelemetry, which is great because that means that we can see more tools start to build on that, as we're starting to see already. So definitely, I think that OpenTrace was a very good step along the way. We had other kind of definitely Jaeger and Prometheus and other tools really contributed to observability in the last years. I think about kind of how far we've come since, just logs or text file logging back in the days to be able to look at systems in a much more mature way. So definitely this was a prerequisite before we can start talking about continuous feedback or applying observability to dev processes.
Chandan is asking, how come Datadog, AppDynamics, Dynatrace, and so on are not part of continuous feedback? Isn't the true use case of OTel to standardize observability data? Production code, method level observability has been there since ages.
So I think that all of these tools are slowly moving towards developers, and you can see it everywhere in the way they're writing. And I'll talk in a second about kind of what is stopping everybody from moving towards continuous feedback, because there are always, one of my mantras as a developer was that, there is no magic. There are always trade-offs. And there are definitely setbacks that are preventing many organizations from moving towards continuous feedback. But please bear in mind that OpenTelemetry is very new. So we're just seeing some of the surfacing of the different features. Now, I do want to also separate between profiling and continuous feedback. Profiling is something very specific. It's meant to look at, to troubleshoot or find out about a specific issue. It's not something you usually do on a continuous basis, although there are some very interesting things going on with profiling and eBPF that might lead to something interesting there. In regard to the role of OpenTelemetry, I don't think a technology has, or this technology has a use case. It's more of a technology that presents us with potential. So what all of the big APMs started doing once OpenTelemetry rolled out was basically get to parity around the features they already offer and kind of standardize so that they can offer these features on top of OpenTelemetry. But we can definitely see that these same platforms are continually trying to see how can we make this more relevant to more people. in the organization. So the use cases are kind of separate from the technology. The technology just gives us the opportunity to start providing these abilities. Now, I could be, there could be somewhere out there organizations that are already adopting continuous feedback. I've seen a few, but it's very hard without the right tooling, as we'll see in a second. And just as a background, and this has been kind of my journey, both with Stigma as well as personally in the last year, I've been talking to a lot of different companies that are on this journey to using observability, right? And these are companies that may have had just logs, or they may have had all of the observability, but developers just didn't have access. And I think, at least, I think it's, by now I've talked to so many companies, it's beyond anecdotal. The vast majority of all of the companies I talk to really struggle with that, not because, again, it's not possible to do code level profiling, or it's not possible to see how specific areas of the code work, but because it's very hard to make it into a sustainable process that's trivial for developers to adopt and use.
I think we got some more, but
Okay,
maybe
let's move on, and
Yeah.
then we'll pause again later.
Mhm.
Perfect. So the first thing that we can do with OTel is we can leverage tools that allow us to trace code. And tracing is a really great concept. It does not replace logging. It is kind of, and people often kind of get confused between when do you log, when do you trace, but it allows you to describe a flow within the system, or to kind of highlight what you want to track, and then see how that flow works. So looking at the example here, you can see I've opened up Jaeger, which is something I'm using in order to look at the different traces for this application that I created. And what I can see is basically the story of what happened for a given request. I can see that because of all of these automatic instrumentation points that I just activated, I can see all the way to the query level if I want, or I can see the higher level processes. So you can see here we have the worker service, which is completely other process, because this is kind of a distributed system. But OpenTelemetry does a great job of kind of joining all of those contexts together and providing me with a view that I can use to actually answer some of these questions. So for example, if I'm working on the Goblin worker and I'm working on one of these different areas of the code, and I want to know, okay, so who's using this code and what is my kind of relative impact on the entire trace, then that becomes very easy to see. More than that, something that Jaeger allows you to see, and maybe let's bring up Jaeger for a second to make it a bit easier for us to see. But one of the things that we can also do, and by the way, here you can kind of see the different services, the different traces from my Vault service, and you can see the duration, and we can see, okay, here I had something that took a lot of time. So we can click on that and kind of see, okay, why did it take a lot of time? And this is, by the way, a classic case of an N+1 query issue that happens a lot, right? But it sometimes doesn't happen in dev or in test because you don't have databases with data that are large enough or that are affecting it in the same way. So this is a classic issue that you might notice only in production later on. But the other nice thing that you can do with Jaeger, and this is actually an interesting new feature that they've introduced, is that you can actually compare two examples. So here I have an example where I can see this n+1 issue happened, which is, I know that because I can see there is an excessive amount of spans, which if I double click into, I'll notice are mostly queries that are repeating themselves because of the n+1 issue. And here I have somewhere that issue doesn't occur, probably because I didn't have as much data, but I can compare. And what it allows me to see is kind of which areas, in this case, retrieving key by key ID was the one that was almost 100 kind of spans more than the other, which again allows me to further understand the problem and behavior. And this might be kind of traditionally seen as something you would do when you're troubleshooting an issue, but what I see being done more and more is developers are actually looking at their code after it's running in production to see when it got picked up and doing the comparison before and after making the commit to see if they made any impact on the system at large that they may not be aware of. And this is where continuous feedback is starting to make observability more relevant to our day-to-day, because we have the tools, and Jaeger is not a complex tool by any means, and there are other commercial tools that allow to do that allow more functionalities around this, so we can include it in not something that only the expert person in the organization and that performance guru cares about, but that every developer can include in their checklist when checking off a feature, to understand not only that they were successful in deploying it, because the point was never to just deploy it. The point was, how do we get that into the hands of users and performing in the way that we expected, or behaving in the way that we expected, or scaling in the way that we expected, and so on. So with that, let's continue to the next topic, and we're going back to Bill. And when we got started, we said, well, the story of Bill was he needs to push things into prod, and we discussed several feedback points. But there is another feedback point, which is I already rolled things into production. I've used the information to check, to understand the code, to review the code, but now information starts flowing back. And that information needs to reach Bill, because he's the one that owns this feature. This is the exact definition of code ownership. It's not something that's just, goes up in the air when I deployed it. I need to see to some extent that it actually works as intended. So as Bill, what I would like to see after merging this important pull request is I would like my Slack bot to tell me, hey, somebody started using your code that you wrote, and this is what we see, and these are the changes, and that's what's new about it. And we've seen, or we're starting to look at it, but we're starting to see an uptick in performance, or the other way around, right? You did a really great job, and it looks like you solved this runtime error that was happening before. And based on that, I can start thinking about, well, am I done? Do I need to do anything more? Maybe I started looking at the backlog and working on the next feature, but maybe I need to not accumulate the technical debt and kind of finish last touches, or maybe it kind of means that my assumptions about this feature were incorrect. Maybe I thought that doing process-based, if not thread-based, I don't know, this distributed job execution would be better, but evidence show it doesn't. So these are the kind of things that I can now include in my thinking. So what's stopping all of this. And this is the really important part, right? Because if this was all very simple, as I'm describing it, then everybody would be doing it. But there are specific things that are preventing organizations from going down that path. And the first is expertise. So bear in mind, I knew nothing about observability a year ago beyond kind of the basics. Over the last year, I've been heavily kind of learning everything I could about it. And I needed to refresh up on my statistics 101 and understand about percentiles and why you can't average means and all sorts of things that, yeah, it made sense to me once. I forgot about it. And it's kind of heavy brain lifting to start making my brain work that way again, and it's the same way, by the way, with repairs in the house. I can master a lot of complex systems, but sometimes repairs, just getting in that mind space kind of is beyond me. It just looks so much hard work. And as developers, we're very busy, we're very focused. And if it requires our expertise, as it often does, to make that information that's being collected relevant, again, in trivial ways, and kind of good, bad, or very easy to understand insights rather than looking at raw data and trying to glean them, then that becomes an impediment. The other issue is context switching. So, and this might have to do with the third reason, but I don't want to context switch to do something else. Like I'm right now, I'm developing code. I'm on the crunch. I have some deadlines that I need to meet. I'm not going to fish around for trouble to look for other things to do. I have my hands full. And every time I context switch to a different application or tool, it detracts from my efficiency. And this is also related to the dashboard fatigue that many developers are feeling, because there are so many dashboards for so many different tools and CLI interfaces that one more thing to keep track of is not a good thing. And it doesn't help that dashboard is a very reactive way to look at the world as well, because a dashboard, I need to know to check, I need to look for something. I've talked to organizations that actually have the same 3 dashboards, and they ask every developer to consult these dashboards every day, which is good, right? It's better than nothing. But what if what they're looking for is not in the dashboard, right? So rather than being very proactive, dashboards are kind of, you're always reacting to something when you're checking it. So the conclusion from that is that the truth is that we really need the right tooling, which is kind of happening already. And that's the good news. So I mentioned Jaeger, and we have Prometheus, and we have other tools that are kind of starting to pick up more traction, especially now that OpenTelemetry is standardized. And more than that, it's now, as I mentioned, trivial to enable OpenTelemetry. So I think I glanced over this slide before, but this is basically my hotel configuration today. That's it. It's a very simple file. It's called a collector component in OpenTelemetry. It's kind of like a router. It says, okay, I'm picking information from OpenTelemetry. I'm going to do some batching to make sure I'm not too chatty about how I communicate that information. And then there is other endpoints. I could use Jaeger, I could use Prometheus, I could use whatever I want. And it doesn't even require me to compile the code. I can make any changes to it on the fly. So this is kind of where we're heading with all of those tools in place. And for my personal journey, this has been what I've been most preoccupied with, these last 3 challenges. And this is why we've come up with Stigma as an open source way to kind of do things, where we're kind of trying to see, okay, as a developer, how can I get that information very, very easily? And how can I actually leverage that in my day-to-day in order to make those decisions? So hope that kind of makes sense. And for me, the future is kind of going even beyond that. It's having something that's really integrated to the extent that you don't need to think about it. So the best tools are those that you don't really need to fiddle with. So, and it's, it's not trivial. And some of the challenges around it is, how do you concentrate on the right things? How do you not create something that's spammy? How do you really kind of present the right information at the right time to the developer so they can use them in their work? And I'll take another pause for questions before I conclude.
Yeah, and I mean, I do see that we're running up on time. So maybe if you want to wrap up, Ron, like quickly.
Perfect.
and then we finish up with the questions, because I know that, so the blocker in your calendar is is an hour, but for attendees is usually 45 minutes, so we're already about 10 minutes over at this point.
Okay, no worries. So I think the trajectory of continuous feedback is something that is already happening. And I can see it in many tools. And by the way, many startups that start appearing kind of on the map that started identifying this very thing. And for me, if we look at the story of Bill, Bill is very close to having that information at his fingertips in a way that doesn't require expertise, that will not require context switching. So it's kind of integrated in how he does his work, and that allows him to be to create much better code, and sometimes much faster, because he'll be saving a lot of different iterations and loops. The quality will improve, and overall, I think continuous feedback will kind of give us that an additional component that's been very neglected, that will optimize the DevOps process and make it, trivial for developers to understand code, to use code, and to kind of interact with it even after it deploys to prod. So I'm also inviting everybody to kind of sign up, go to our GitHub at Digma, because those are exactly the concept that we're trying to do. And feel free, it's free and open source, so just experiment as much as you want. But I'm also very interested in feedback, continuous feedback, right? So I'm very keen to hear kind of where that meets you in some of the challenges that you're seeing as a developer, or as a DevOps engineer, or as somebody who cares about the release process in general, any type of stakeholder. What are the steps that you think are missing, and what are the steps that you think might not be solvable? So please be very happy to hear from you, either on Twitter. My handle is Doppelware, DOPPLEWARE, and I'll send it as well in the show notes, or just reach out via the website. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Ron. And we have a good amount of people that stuck around, and a good amount of questions. So let's just do a rapid fire. All right. So Ardit is asking, should I use OpenTelemetry on Azure Monitor, considering that Azure already offers application insights? Maybe you're familiar with that.
Yeah. So I think that ultimately, and I could be wrong, but my prediction is that kind of like how Kubernetes, kind of other platforms were struggling and trying to promote their own proprietary thing. If you remember, there were a lot of competition to Kubernetes, but eventually it became the standard. And then suddenly EKS, AKS started appearing. Everybody kind of started transitioning to it. I think the democratization of OpenTelemetry will eventually long-term make it a standard that will be followed also by Azure and AWS in a much, much more integrated way. It will just take time. So I don't think the technology itself is important. If right now most of your information comes from Azure Insights, then yeah, it's about how to employ it and how to, what you should be asking yourself is the information from Azure Insights. Are you using it? What are you doing with it? What are the use cases in your organizations and what can still be improved there?
Nice. We got Lesgin, I hope I pronounced it right. Do you know if AWS or other cloud providers will support to send metrics to custom destination supporting OpenTel for their managed services?
I cannot speak for AWS, but I do know there are a lot of really smart people from AWS that are very active in the OTel community. I don't know if that kind of foreshadows the fact that the AWS might have more support for it or not, but I definitely think we'll see more and more around that.
And Angel is asking, what do you recommend to start steering this cultural change? So without creating too much friction, and also, I guess we could also add his second question, which is, what are the top 5 metrics that a developer dashboard should track and display?
Okay, so the first question around doing the cultural change, I think that's, of all the changes, the cultural ones are the most difficult. And it was equally as challenging to move people, to agile, or to move people to better code ownership and testing and convince them that it's not a waste of time to write automation tests. I've been on that journey in the past many years ago with teams. And I think that the most important way to do it is to start paying attention to it. And that means having a meeting just about that. Or I think that it is something that is best led through champions who are the kind of senior developers that can kind of dictate the tone. So for example, let's look at the code review story. So if I'm a senior developer and I'm doing the code review, and before I do the code review, I'm going to actually consult the observability. And then when you come to me, junior developer, with your code review, I'm going to tell you, well, I looked at the observability and these are the things you missed. Next time I'll probably want to consult the observability first and not kind of only discover that after the fact. So if we make information valuable, if we make it worthwhile to hold the information, then it will be widely adopted. It won't be widely adopted if we just tell people, look at the dashboards. And this leads to the second question that you asked. I think the dashboards are not the solution. I think dashboards, metrics are really important. Understanding there are many different things to notice about the code, but I think it's a dynamic thing. So I kind of look at it like a background process that always needs to look for things, and the number of things that you're looking for is gradually changing. If you focus on a dashboard and specific metrics, you get that kind of same false sense of confidence you get from tests being green, right? Because you don't see right and left of the metrics that you've defined. You're just testing to your assumptions. So this is why I think that the right solution is having a growing number of different metrics that are continually checked. And some of them are around performance and trends around performance, right? Some of them are around runtime errors, and some of them are around data or usage. So you want to know when you're writing the code, you want to know if you're handling an array from production without checking that array can be 1 million members in size, and maybe not the best idea to send it off to a query without batching, or that it's 3 or 4 in size and it will never change. So these are the kind of things that you want to have constant access to. So I call it the observability of everyday things. It's not the big observability dashboard on the wall that some people think is just a picture, right? Because it's so dominant in the view, but something that always gives me insights about what I'm doing next, and continually looks for different things. And this is why I think open source is also the way to go, because I think not just one person should contribute to the things that we're looking for, but everybody should be contributing to that. And if you're a database expert, in their organization, then you should be contributing the things that you think are worth looking at with database queries and anti-patterns there. And if you're a performance expert, you should be contributing what you know about what it means if there are specific behaviors that you should be noticing around it being very, very slow for some users and not others, and so on. So these are the kind of things that that we should create more as a platform and less as a given set of dashboards.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think that also kind of addresses what Chandan was saying around APM versus open source. And unfortunately, that's just in the chat. I always try to remind people to use the to everyone so that everybody can read it. But I think you addressed that already. Ron, thank you so much. I think we ran a little bit over, but thanks to everybody that stuck around. There's a really good amount of questions, and as you said, people can find you on Twitter. They can also find you in the platform engineering Slack. I saw you just joined before the call, so we'll include the recording and the links to your profile and so on in the follow-up email tomorrow, so everyone can get that. Awesome, Ron. Thank you so much again. Amazing session, super interesting, and see you around hopefully.
Thank you for having me.